15.
Wow, I just wanted to take a moment to sit and think about what Theresa had to say. And I have to say I was quite nervous about doing this. I'm a debut author. For many, many years, my role at events like this would be to stand somewhere in the back where no one could see me, keeping an eye on things, watching out for people like John, who would cause all sorts of problems for the politicians I was working for, and listening to prominent people deliver words that I had written with them, or more accurately, for them. So to be here, standing here, is an unusual turn of events in my life. And so if I stumble, it's because I'm a little nervous. But anyway, I want to begin by taking you back to January 2021, to the early stages of the pandemic. The north of England, where I was living, was blanketed by snow, including my house, which is in a very isolated spot where I'd moved to be close to my parents. Most days, as you can tell, the sky could barely be distinguished from the land. It was either grey and leaden or blue and ethereal and empty. And I had the feeling, unlike Herbie, that I had been cut off from what I absolutely loved doing. I'd worked as a special advisor in government for many years, and then I left in 2014 and carried on doing similar work, but outside government, for reasons that are outside the scope of this talk, but you might be able to guess at. But anyway, the sky brooded, the hawks on the roof of the house brooded, and I brooded, chewing over everything that I felt I was missing out on, the constant overseas travel that went along with my work, the constant adrenaline, the feeling of having a ringside view on world events, and the constant travel. I did what we all did. I baked baguettes, I Zoom called, I worried about my family, I spread corn for famished birds, and I essentially waited impatiently for life to return to normal. And one day, early in February, I stepped out into the weak sunlight. The snow had just receded, the ground was waterlogged, the wind was bitter, and I'd been drawn outside by what was an unusual sound for that location, which was the sound of a dog frantically barking and a man shouting, and I went out to investigate, and within moments I stumbled upon this little creature, which I immediately and instinctively knew was a leveret, a baby hare, a newborn baby hare in this case. Even though I had never seen such an animal before, it seemed to me so intensely wild, with its dark fur, its wide open eyes, and those kind of nascent, powerful haunches, all of which point to an animal that lives its entire life above ground, exposed to the elements from its first moments. And there was something odd about its position. It was right in the open, in the middle of the track. It felt totally out of place. It was very, very exposed to predators, of which there are many. And I concluded that it had probably been chased by the dog that I'd heard, and possibly even picked up and carried for some time before being deposited on the track. And I worried about it. I stood a little distance away and thought about it. But I knew, even as a city woman, a city girl, that animals in the wild should be left to their own devices. So I went on my way. But I came back 4 hours later and found that the creature hadn't moved. If you could move on to the next slide, that'd be great, thank you. And I stood there and I thought about it, and I made a snap decision, well, I call it a snap decision, but I thought deeply about it, that I would bring this little animal into my house temporarily, as I thought, and that I would return it to the field as soon as night fell, where I thought that perhaps it would have a greater chance of being reunited with its mother. So I remembered dimly from childhood that it was important not to transfer your scent onto wild animals, so I plucked handfuls of dried grass from the track by the side of the field where I found this little animal. And I picked it up and carried it carefully into my house, planning, thinking, okay, it's only a few hours until nightfall. But I then rang a local conservationist, a former gamekeeper, and he quickly said to me, essentially, forget about it. Even though you've gone to lengths to avoid, as it were, contaminating this animal with your scent, it's still going to smell of a human home, and even if its mother is still alive, which he thought might be in doubt, she would be likely to reject it. And he didn't stop there. He went on to say to me that since hares have never been domesticated, and moreover, frequently die of stress in human hands, I ought to accept that the most likely outcome was that this little animal would die. And you can imagine my feelings. I felt absolutely mortified. I'd intervened in the life of this animal, and I just could not bear the prospect of it dying. So I resolved then and there that somehow I had to find a way to keep it alive. Perhaps we can move on. And it didn't die. To my great astonishment, I managed to work out how to feed it, how to trickle milk into its tiny little mouth on the underside of its head, and very quickly it took over my house. And you see it here resting on the 6th step of the staircase behind my desk that goes up towards my bedroom. And every day at 9 a.m. sharp, little leveret would climb upstairs and lie under my bed in a fold of blanket or duvet and sleep all day long while I worked. And at 4 o'clock on the dot, it would come down the stairs and it would rest here on its step. And I used to find it extremely difficult not to break away from whatever I was doing and just spend hours gazing at this animal. And you may have heard the idea that hares are crazy, unpredictable, timid, cowardly even. But I quickly learned that hares are elegant and calm and reserved and mysterious and beautiful. They're also astonishingly clean. This animal, in all the years I've known it, has never left droppings in my house, which is part of its survival strategy rather than a question of manners, but it's definitely appreciated, and the whole relationship would have been impossible without it. And they're also curious and incredibly endearing, and when it was very small, the leveret quite often would wake me in the morning by drumming on my duvet with its forepaws at high speed at very early hours of the day, as soon as the first light had appeared over the horizon. And I'm convinced that it didn't do it because it wanted my attention. It just loved the sound of its paws on the soft fabric, because particularly when there would be a heavy downpour and the raindrops would be plinking off the tiles on the roof, the little leveret would go absolutely nuts with joy, it seemed, and would drum on anything it could find. I never could quite understand why it did this, but it certainly took a huge amount of pleasure from it. And I wrestled throughout this time with two questions. I knew this state of affairs couldn't last, and I wondered when would be the right moment to return the creature to the wild, which was really my intention throughout. And I also wondered whether it would survive the experience. And in the end, the leveret took the decision out of my hands. One day, it leapt the wall surrounding the garden, which was no mean feat, given that the wall was over 4 feet high and the leveret was only 4 months old. And for all my talk and belief that this animal belonged in the wild, I cried. I didn't expect to. I had prepared myself for this moment, and it seemed entirely natural. But I also found that for all my talk of wishing to return to London, I was suddenly not so sure that I did want to do that in the way that I had imagined. And I emphasized that, unlike Herbie, I had always felt that my career was full of purpose and worth the battle, and I could not imagine in any kind of way ever deviating from the path that I had imagined. But during these 4 months, unbeknownst to me, the hare had sort of worked on my emotions. I'd made all sorts of practical changes to accommodate it. Even to this day, I have this weird habit now of not turning on the lights at night. I'm very comfortable moving around the house in the darkness because I felt that was the best way to protect the leveret's night vision, but used to freak out my friends as they'd come across me moving around the house. And there were lots of other kind of practical changes I made to accommodate this creature. But also more profoundly, it opened my eyes to nature. I began, the further afield the leveret roamed, the more my gaze followed it, and the more my feelings altered. So I felt in that moment when the leveret was on the wall and then suddenly it was gone, it melted into the landscape, I felt a profound sense of loss. I wasn't ready for the experience to end. But luckily it turned out that neither was the leveret or the hare at this point, although technically they're leverets for the first year of their life, so even though it looks large, it's still a leveret. But despite having the limitless wild around it, despite the attractions of the company of other hares, the leveret chose to return. And from this moment on, this became its pattern. At night, it would leap the wall, roam in the wild, and in the morning, it would return and it would rest in my house. And this became its favorite resting place across the doorway to my office. And if you can believe it, this was my view while I wrote the book. And a living, breathing, relaxed hare lying meters away from me, completely sort of chilled out and oblivious to me. You know, unlike, this is not an animal like a dog or a cat that will sort of paw your leg or make any kind of noise. It's utterly silent and utterly independent. But this is where it chose to lie. And you'll often read, because I was researching the subject deeply at this point, you'll often read that hares never or seldom close their eyes. And the hare would start the day like this, very alert. And then it would gradually sort of loll over to one side and stretch itself out and shut its eyes and fall deeply asleep for hours. And you cannot imagine how I tiptoed around the house on those days because of the extraordinary feeling and knowledge that there was a hare asleep in my house. And you will notice that I've been calling it because for the first year and a half of its life, I had no idea whether it was male or female, and I'm not going to give away too many spoilers from the book, but I will say one detail, which is that yet again the leveret settled this question for me. And after various twists and turns in the story, one day she gave birth to this pair of leverets, not just inside the shelter of the garden, not just inside the house, but in my office, behind the curtain next to the desk where I slept. And for the next 4 weeks of their lives, she would come twice at night to feed them, the first sign of nightfall and then just before dawn. And then at dawn, she would tuck them into hiding places inside the office, which is the only way, in a country setting that a hare can keep its, or try to keep its leverets safe. And she would scrape the carpet around their hiding places with her paws, with these delicate gestures, and then leap away in a big bound. And I would work for those 4 weeks with one little leveret tucked into the bookcase behind me and the other under a radiator or behind a curtain, and sometimes I could just see a little paw sticking out. And I would pretend I couldn't see them, and we functioned absolutely perfectly, and they would lie in position, absolutely immobile, for up to 12 hours, because it was the summer at the time, and all they can do until nightfall is just wait. And I found it incredibly moving. I make light of it now, but the idea that she felt safe enough to do this, and that I had the opportunity to witness this up close, the birth and the raising of these little leverets, and in time they grew big enough to leave the house, which was by now kept constantly open so hares could come and go at will. And they acquired this habit, just when I thought they were going to sort of go off into the wild, of stretching out side by side on my sofa like a pair of basking seals. And I would have to pick my way around the house, getting various looks which I would like to think of in human terms of being reproachful when I would wake a hare in the middle of the night. But, if we could move on, please. But the thing I want to say is that the hare doesn't belong to me. I've never tamed her. I've never tried to, and I wouldn't want to. She's flighty. She remains nervous around other people. Her life in the wild is a mystery to me. And really, apart from the first few weeks of her life, she didn't need me. She gets all the food that she requires from nature. She simply comes home, to my home, as it were, to rest, because that is the extent, that is the strength of the connection between a hare and a patch of land. This is what hares are doing up and down the country in the places where they are still safe enough to exist. Only human activity will displace them from the patch of land that they call home. And I think, honestly, that she regards me as part of the landscape. And in a way, I can think of no greater compliment that I am a feature of the life of these animals without being a threat and without seeking to own them or constrain them. And I'm nearly at the end. This is a recent photograph of the hare, and sometimes she disappears for weeks and then returns as if she'd never been away. And at the moment, she's on one of those disappearances, hopefully just to breed. But if not now, one day it will be forever. And I don't know how the story will end, but I have come to realize that hares are deeply misunderstood, both in terms of their nature and their place in nature. They're often labeled as pests and persecuted. They're the only game species in England and Wales that you can shoot at any time of year, even during the breeding season. So while all other game, deer, for example, are given some respite from hunting to be able to congregate and breed, hares have no such respite, and hare shoots are happening up and down the country as we speak. This is the real month for them in February. And they are, contrary to all stereotype, contrary to myth and legend, they are extraordinary creatures. They are tenacious and dignified. They are beautiful, and they are vital to our ecosystem. And as I say in the book, if I could, I would change the phrase "mad as a March hare" in our language with "as faithful as a hare and as constant." My experience with the hare has given me hope that it might be possible to find better ways to coexist with wild animals. I may have got many things wrong with the hare, and I describe some of these in my book, but I got something right. I never named her or treated her as a pet or constrained her, and in return, she trusted me. And it has given me, therefore, enormous hope, even if the circumstances are slightly unusual and not easily replicable, and nor would I advise it, since hares do belong in the wild. But I would also like to think, going back to Herbie, that she has made me better at what I do. I mean, I'm doing it slightly differently now. I find it very hard to leave this patch of land and the hares that I've come to know, but she has broadened my understanding of human nature, of our place in nature, of how wrong it is that we live lives that are so alienated from nature. And I think I could fairly say that her effect on me grows over time. If I could conclude with one thought, which I'm going to read because it's a poet's work and I don't want to butcher it, but it's a verse from a poem by Thomas Hardy, who wrote, "Whence comes solace, not from seeing what is doing, suffering, being, not from noting life's conditions, nor from heeding time's monitions, but in cleaving to the dream, and in gazing at the gleam, whereby grey things golden seem." The hare has cast a golden gleam over my life, and I hope in a small way that through the book she will shed light on the lives of other people, now and long into the future, when both I and the hare are long gone, but hares, I hope, still remain. Thank you.